Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Stephanie Golub, and I'd like to welcome you to a roundtable on identity politics and campaign 2020. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This event is presented by the Baruch College Department of Political Science in partnership with the Department of Black and Latinx Studies. It's really my pleasure to welcome you here for this forum where we can examine and discuss issues that matter to all of us in this great season of decision for our country at a moment when early voting has already started. So before I begin, I want to first acknowledge the ongoing work of our department's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which is chaired by our department chair, David Jones, who's here with us this evening. Good to see you, David. We invite students to contact us with your feedback on this event and with your ideas for future events of this nature. On behalf of our committee and our department, I also want to thank the Department of Black and Latinx Studies and its interim chair, Professor Shelley Eversley, who's also here today. Good to see you, for partnering with us and co-sponsoring this event. And we look forward to many more opportunities to work together in the future. This event is a roundtable, which is not your usual panel event. We really want to encourage the idea that we are going to be having a conversation here, and we do invite you to consider yourselves part of it. It's going to start as a conversation starting out with the views and analysis of our invited speakers for about the first 20 minutes or so, but then it's going to open up, and we're going to ask if you are interested in saying something. You have two options. You can raise your hand in the participants, if you can see there's a little function for raising your hand, or if you feel that you would rather type it into the chat, that would be great. Type it into the chat. The chat will be monitored today by my colleague, Professor David Lindsay, and I want to thank him for his help with keeping our conversation open and on track. So please join me virtually in welcoming our speakers for this roundtable this evening, and allow me to introduce them to you. Speakers are Tanisha Mahmud, who is a sophomore at Baruch College, pursuing a double major in political science and English. Tanisha is currently a student in English 3835, Black Women Writers, with Professor Shelley Eversley. Welcome, Tanisha. Professor Viviana Rivera-Burgos just joined the Baruch faculty this semester as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, and she's also affiliated faculty in the Department of Black and Latinx Studies. Professor Rivera-Burgos specializes in American public opinion and political behavior, particularly as they relate to racial and ethnic minorities. The focus of her current research is on the responsiveness of national and state legislators to the policy preferences of their Black and Latino constituents. At Baruch, she teaches our Introduction to American Government course, Political Science 1101, and next semester, she will also be teaching a special topics course, Political Science 3999 on Latino politics in the US, and the information should be in the chat if you're interested in checking out this course and signing up for it. She holds a BA in political science from the Universidad de Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and an MPhil and PhD degree in political science from Columbia University. Welcome, Professor Rivera-Burgos. And we're also happy to have with us today my colleague at the Graduate Center, Professor Michael Fortner, who's an assistant professor in the PhD MA program in political science at the Grad Center, where he also serves as the MA program advisor. His work studies the intersection of American political development and political philosophy, particularly in the areas of race, ethnicity, and class. He's the author of Black Silent Majority, The Rockefeller Drug Laws and the Politics of Punishment, published by Harvard University Press in 2015, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and the winner of the New York Academy of History's Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in New York History. Along with Amy Bridges, he edited a volume on city politics called Urban Citizenship and American Democracy from CUNY Press. And in addition to his scholarly work, Professor Fortner contributes frequently to public debate on pressing issues of race and class. His most recent essay, Black Bodies and the Problem of Linked Fate, was just published in Logos, the Journal of Modern Society and Culture. And I think that should be in the chat if you want to check out that article. Professor Fortner holds a BA in Political Science and African American Studies from Emory University and a PhD in Government and Social Policy from Harvard University. So join me in virtually welcoming our panelists, our speakers. Thank you. So the first question to get this conversation started is really the question of what do we mean by identity politics? I put it forward as the topic for this roundtable. But we political scientists just love to talk about definitions, and there's a reason, right? Because we really have to think about what we mean by our terms. So let's talk a bit about what do we mean by identity politics, and I want to ask Tanisha if she'll start us off, please.
Yeah, of course, I'll be happy to start off. Firstly, I just want to say hey, and thank you to the Political Science Department and the Black and Latinx Department for organizing this. I'm super excited to be here. So in terms of identity politics, it's such a broad topic and there's a wide spectrum it covers, but and I'm sure we're all each gonna have a different definition of identity politics. But for this conversation, my definition of identity politics has two facets. The first being the voters, and the voters voting for politicians based upon their personal identity. For example, maybe a voter who wants a woman president. And the second side of my definition of identity politics is politicians with the belief that people of a certain identity, be it gender, race, religion, they will vote similarly, they will vote in blocks. And so that politician will try to win over their chunk of the electorate, probably by sympathizing with some of the issues that interest that group.
Terrific. That's a great start. So, Professor Rivera-Burgos, how do you feel about that definition? Would you add to it? How would you feel in terms of the division that she's made? Thank you, Tanisha. Excellent start.
Yes, thank you so much. I would definitely agree with that, and sure, I can add a little to it. But I think Tanisha brought up one of the main points that I would bring up when we talk about identity politics and defining it, and it's that in a way, it represents a move, and this is a critique that some people make of it. It represents a move away from broad-based party politics and more towards exclusive political attitudes of given groups that are based on not just race and ethnicity, which I think is what most of us think about first, but also religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, things like that. So one way I would define it is as a politicization of areas of life that were not previously defined as political. So things, again, like sexuality, interpersonal relations, lifestyle, culture. And there really is an emphasis on experiences of injustice and marginalization in this definition. So, for example, we might think about environmentalists as an identity group because they share an important concern, but that identity is not based on injustice and grievances necessarily, although it can be if we think about it intersectionally. But another important factor of that is that it's not externally imposed, as a lot of these other identities that we talk about are. So I think that's a big and a very important distinction to make. Another thing I really wanted to highlight was that this is not unique to the US. And of course, we're talking about the American context today, and we're talking about the election next week. And these things work in a particular way in the US, but identity politics is a term that is widely used to describe phenomena in different parts of the world that have to do with nationalism, ethnic violence in post-colonial regimes, things like separatist movements. So it's definitely not unique to the US. And finally, last thing I'll say in this segment is that when I started to think about identity politics and learn about them, I always thought, and I think a lot of people a few years ago always thought of minorities. And like I said, groups that have been marginalized and oppressed historically in the US. But in recent years, I think we've seen both in popular discourse, the media, but also in scholarly work, a resurgence, or no, I don't want to say emergence, definitely a resurgence of white identity. So whiteness as a racial category, which was often viewed as the default that everyone else defined themselves around as a deviation from that, is no longer like that in the eyes of many people. So whiteness has taken on a political significance again that it definitely used to have, but kind of stopped having for a while. And now it's a very salient identity again for many people. So I think it's important to include that when we think about identity politics in 2020, especially.
Thank you. Terrific. Wow. So Professor Fortner,
Yeah, so
how do you see
Stephanie,
this?
I'm going to be completely disappointing in this regard because I don't know what it is. And so I don't have an answer to the foundational question of this panel. What is identity politics? I don't know what it is. And here I'm inspired by the work of the great sociologist Rogers Brubaker, who wrote this amazing essay and has a body of work around this idea of beyond identity. And one of his foundational claims is that identity as a concept has been very fuzzy across disciplines and within disciplines. And so he explores the various reasons why it's fuzzy. And then he says, perhaps what we need to do is distinguish between categories of practice and categories of analysis. That is to say, there are some identities and identity politics exist and function in the real world. People use these categories in particular ways, but we shouldn't allow how their common practice functions and what their common purposes are to define the analytical lens that we employ to understand that. So in this instance, I think that means that there is such thing as identity politics that is deployed in American politics, and like we just heard, in a lot of different nations. But the question I'm interested in is, what work is it doing in our politics? How does it function in this political moment? We know from the 1980s and the 1990s that identity politics was used by the center and the right to critique and to demobilize groups, racial minorities, and marginalized groups, and their cries for greater justice and representation. And I'm interested now in the ways that identity politics as a practice in our as a sort of a concept in our current political practice is being deployed on the left. And I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen here, but there's a way in which identity politics can be deployed to undermine the development and the movement of working class identities, identities around work, identities around precarity, right? And so I'm looking forward, in this election and afterwards, is what is the left going to do in terms of identity politics? How is it going to make sense of this moment of racial awakening, but also class mobilization? And I think that, for me, that's the interesting question that I'll be looking to answer over the next coming weeks. And so I apologize for not answering the foundational question, but I hope we're able to have a conversation about the ways in which identity politics matters in our current political practice.
Yeah, I see on the chat that Brian O'Reilly Costello says the left went from inclusion to division. So what do you say about that? Do you see
Can
it?
I respond to that quickly?
Oh yeah, go ahead, please.
I actually wanted to bring that up and maybe ask some of the students here what they thought about that, because that, I think, a common critique of identity politics is that it does precisely that it divides. It's like the divide and rule tactic. Some people say it diverts energy and attention away from more fundamental issues and creates all of these divisions. And even within the left especially, it creates all these fragmented and isolated groups that have nothing in common except for their opposition to a common enemy. So that ends up being detrimental to the left. And some people think that has enabled or fueled the resurgence of the far right in the US. So I think that's a super important thing to discuss. Does it hurt certain causes more, the causes that that the left is trying maybe to advance with these appealing and activating identity politics? Does it hurt more than it helps?
Right, yeah, so Brian also followed up by saying that it sounds like tribalism, right? So we worry about that in terms of when we think about identity as it's, the Weber, the whole idea of it's the in-group against the out-group, right? How is the in-group and the out-group defined? And that's always subjectively and intersubjectively, right? So it's the question of how things are being mobilized. Hadra Shawkat on the chat says, how do you define the left, Dr. Fortner?
So here I'm speaking about the modern left, and particularly in New York City, DSA, a lot of my students, you know, activists in the Bernie Sanders campaign. I think I've been energized by this renewed class-based politics that's been coming from young people and from people on the left. And I'm also emboldened by their ability to combine race and class in ways that I don't think previous generations have. But the question becomes, is that sustainable? What happens next, depending on who wins? What you know, what kind of movement on the left, center left will we have, and what will be, you know, and how do we make sure that that perspective emphasizes economic disadvantage, as you know, in addition to racial injustice and all these other kind of sort of social structures and forms of domination that's plaguing American society. I am slightly pessimistic. I mean, we're going to talk about this, about, you know, what we expect to see in the election, but I'm slightly pessimistic because I think there's a way in which our categories of practice undermine our ability to be a bit more revolutionary in our actual politics and perhaps in our own analysis. For example, you know, there's a lot of focus on suburban white women and you know, what they're going to do in these elections, and why, you know, they're you know, not pleased with Donald Trump. And there, you know, there's these sort of interesting, almost cultural explanations and sort of identity-based explanations for what's happening with that group. But if you look at a lot of what's happening in Senate races and what issues are driving people, it's about healthcare. It's about sort of material concerns. And so the question for me is, you know, why do we as a sort of political community marshal certain types of identities, certain types of concepts, when we also know that sort of economic issues, a lack of access to healthcare, quality healthcare, is sort of, you know, driving people to the polls. And maybe if we had sort of new concepts to understand those types of mobilizations, then we will have sort of a vigorous politics and a robust sort of left of center policy regime in the future.
Yeah, so I just want to go back a little bit about what you said, to connect with Tanisha. Tanisha, not to put you on the spot to speak for your generation, but I'd like you to think about, you know, out loud for us about how you view what Professor Fortner was saying about your generation as being able to conceive of the sort of race and class together in the new politics of the left. Do you see that among your classmates or among your friends in your generation, that your generation views politics in a different way?
Yeah, absolutely. I do have to agree. Sort of to connect it, one of my personal critiques, and something that I hear a lot of political scientists say as a criticism against identity politics, is that it oversimplifies the identity. You know, it presupposes that someone is going to act some way or have some priorities based on one facet of who they are. But obviously, who they are is going to be multifaceted, and are going to belong to many different groups. A person who identifies as Latinx, who is Latinx and is gay, he can also be a business owner with business interests in mind first. So there can be different ranks of priorities that kind of make it so there's not a coherent direction that identity politics can identify that a specific category reaches. I was 8 years old, really, when Barack Obama took office, and you know, as politically informed as an 8-year-old can be, the one thing that I knew about Barack Obama was that he was the first African American to take office. That is one thing that the adults around me emphasized. That's one thing that the kids around me knew, and I guess that was like my first engagement with politics. And so identity politics has just been a very prevalent, a very strong and present force in my entire political experience thus far.
That's so interesting. And so that's also, if you think about it, you were 8 years old in 2008, but it was also when the financial crisis happened. So your generation also has experienced the first African-American president, but also the aftermath of the financial crisis, right? So there's certain kinds of it's very interesting to hear that impact. We actually have a bunch of people lining up on the chat here. So Hajar Shaukat said I personally think part of this divide with identity politics is that we focus more on academic speak which excludes people from joining these kinds of groups. I also think there's more of a focus on implementing theory versus praxis rather than, yes, learning theory, but adapting it. So if anyone wants to respond, that's this is also an important aspect, because yes, we do parse things as academics, but we are also thinking what are, as Professor Fortner was saying, what are we, what is our practice of politics?
I can say something quickly about that. I think I mean, I agree with the general statement for sure. I think, and again, that is a common critique of identity politics, that it is overly concerned with language, and it tends towards moralizing. So it kind of puts diversity as the highest moral good, versus the more conservative movements place traditional values as the moral good, and then it becomes like a debate between those two things. And the moralizing that is often seen in identity politics, and not just academic circles, but activists, I do think tends to, that's one of the downsides of it, that it excludes many people, or it draws these lines between who is and who is not included. So it's definitely an important concern, I think, to think about.
Terrific, thank you. We have from Professor Shelley Eversley, if the personal is political, a feminist logic, then aren't all politics identity politics? Hasn't it always been? Can it be that this conversation in 2020 takes on a new or nuanced meaning, since all of a sudden the kinds of people who support Trump have taken over a version of identity politics that, in an oppositional mode, they unite so many on the other side? It's as if identity politics in this election flatten out the nuance and complexity, the personal/individual concerns politics. So that speaks also to what you said, Viviana, about the activation of white identity, correct?
Sorry. Yes, definitely. I don't know. I mean, I also want to go back to a point I made earlier. I do wonder about that, if the personal is always political and if everything is identity politics. I'm not sure. I mean, I think you can make a case for a lot of things, but I think that external, what's the word? Imposition of certain identities is missing from certain personal experiences. And then not sure that so certain things that maybe don't qualify as identity politics, but I definitely understand, know that comes from that feminist logic. And I agree with it in many instances, but I don't know that it applies across the board.
I agree with that. I mean, I think it is important to emphasize the way the personal is political, but it's also important to understand that individuals exist within broader political contexts, right? And political processes can activate certain identities at certain times and not others. And so the question is not merely about how the personal is political, but how sort of social and political structures sort of come together at certain moments to create incentives to highlight certain identities that may or may not have been salient before that political moment.
Yeah, and I would also add that this idea of salience and identity is, there's, the famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas, which was asking, how could it be that so many people who, had been so progressive in Kansas, and now suddenly they're all voting Republican? And we're saying that, well, in some certain parts of their vote was being activated by ideology, and some of it was being activated by material interest. So we have sort of identity, ideology, and material interest all kind of interplaying in political scientists. That's the difficult part of it, is how do you tease those out? How do you figure out, because they interact, right? You can't say that the activation of white identity isn't connected in some ways to a zero-sum game, feeling that if other people, if I'm losing, then someone else is gaining at my expense. So this is something also to think about, that we can't sometimes, it's very difficult to pull those things apart.
And so for me, Stephanie, that's why I think the language of identity, again, is sort of, it's a practice, but can get confusing in the analysis. I mean, I think what you said is this sort of social dominance perspective, and and the ways in which new moments and new threats can sort of, and political sort of activating of political groups can create sort of, or make salient certain identities that weren't before. And I think it's sort of analytically useful to focus on those processes more so than this thing we call identity.
Yeah, there's a comment from Professor DeGraw in the chat. She says, "Are identity politics something new, or are there notable instances of earlier episodes of identity politics in the U.S. or beyond? Are identity politics today different from earlier instances?" That's really an excellent question. Who'd like to take a stab at that?
So it's, I mean, again, it depends on how you define identity politics. You know, the idea that someone's racial group, social group, economic group is an important factor in American politics. That's not new at all, right? That's constantly the case. You have Irish political machines in the early part of the century, and you had sort of white middle class mobilization against those Irish machines. But they didn't necessarily call it identity politics. And so that's why I think, again, the question is, what is this thing, identity politics, and how is it functioning in contemporary politics? And I think it is an interesting question of how this thing, this phenomenon, I think assumes a new kind of meaning, a new properties in the contemporary context that it didn't have in a previous context, even though social groups, ethnicity, class, etc., have always been important in American politics.
I was wondering if there was a sense of what really makes the identity politics different. And I mean, I'm kind of jumping to Professor Eversley has a follow-up. He says, put another way, more simply, how much is the rise of Trump a backlash against fear of a Black president, right? So this is, identity politics are very clear. And Tanisha, in your experience as a child, seeing how Obama was defined in that way, right? It was in some ways that breakthrough moment for African American to become president. But was the rise of Trump a backlash against fear of a Black president, fear of the loss? Professor Eversley says fear of the loss of a white majority and the power associated with whiteness. So maybe what we're talking about here is that the innovation, where the salience of whiteness is that Professor Rivera-Burgos brought up, is really what we're talking about. Because if you think about it, there was, I mean, everybody remembers the Southern strategy, or everybody who remembers Richard Nixon remembers that there's a lot of talking about race talking about whiteness without talking about whiteness. Oh, this is the coalition, the moral majority, the Tea Party. These sorts of movements are spoken about as if they don't also have some kind of identity component, and that in this particular campaign, and now we're moving into the sort of the second part of talking about how we view this happening in campaign 2020, that in the past, maybe we haven't been as open, right? There's been a certain kind of taboo against, because the assumption was that whiteness was the default, and that everyone else had to define themselves within this political environment. And so maybe what we're seeing is that it's not that identity politics is new, it's that there is a different dynamic because there's a mobilization on race. And you could say that this is happening in other countries around the world in terms of nationalism, that certain kinds of mobilizations that used to be taboo are now, the sort of the movement in Poland, the movement that's really that we see, and others, and that are mobilizing identities that before people weren't talking about.
Can I add to that quickly?
Yeah.
In response to Professor Eversley's question, I definitely think, I mean, not sure this is based on evidence and research, but more on opinion. But yes, I definitely think a lot of it has to do with backlash. The rise of Trump has to be explained in the context, or cannot be explained without talking about that backlash, which has been referred to as the white lash against President Obama. And one interesting piece of evidence that I have come across in that regard is that, that white lash, I don't think is, like most of these things we talk about, I don't think is new. I just think it reached a peak after, maybe because of having the first Black president. But evidence has shown, polling evidence, public opinion data throughout the years, that Democratic candidates who were perceived to be too racially liberal or who made too specific racial appeals would always lose votes or support from white liberals. But that since 2016, it started to shift, where now Democratic candidates are rewarded for making those explicit racial appeals. So it's interesting to see how that has changed, and how a lot of white Democrats particularly have gone from maybe not feeling animus or condemning those racial appeals, but definitely feeling uncomfortable by them and trying to like shy away from them. And, you know, the discourse was the colorblind post-racial society, that doesn't matter anymore, to now moving to like, no, we need our candidates to have explicit stances on this and to make appeals about racial justice. So I think that's been an interesting development in the Trump era for sure.
So I think we also need to make a distinction between what explains electoral outcomes and what might be driving some on the left and the right in various scenarios. I mean, he did win twice, right? And so there is a question of if there is this sort of automatic sort of racial backlash, what happened the second time around in terms of its power. That's not to sort of underestimate this move to activate whiteness. I think my point is rather that and instead of focusing on electoral outcomes as sort of a way to explain what happened with Obama, we need to explain how certain sort of interest groups and mobilizations and formations sort of decided to use race strategically against Obama while he was governing, and perhaps during the 2016 election. And you do have like the Tea Party, right? I mean, it's not necessarily a grassroots movement, but sort of funding from the Coke industries and other things. And so there's a sort of a broader structural context to the activation of whiteness. And I think sometimes just attending to the appearance of whiteness might, I think, obscure the equally important ways in which whiteness has been activated by sort of structural forces as well as political processes.
Yes, we do have a couple of comments in the chat about the idea of the question of, is this bottom up? I'm thinking about, is identity politics something that is there, and so you have elites that recognize it and give it voice, or you're talking about more a matter of activating certain identities as an electoral appeal, right? It's kind of a chicken and the egg proposition in some ways, and that's why the data would be interesting to see with public opinion polling, to see how, where this comes from. This is a social conversation in ethnic conflict studies, the study of the start of civil wars is, these identities don't appear to, people are living peacefully together and suddenly it's not suddenly ever. And in fact, we have a comment here about this, saying, this is from Joaquin Orozco, who says, personally, I believe that identity politics were made earlier in history, since white groups such as the KKK were influenced by politics, if I recall correctly. Not only that, but the government did try to stop African Americans from voting, right? So this idea that there is, that this has been going on for a very long time. It's just that certain kinds of speech, but Professor Rivera-Burgos was talking about in terms of that you couldn't say certain things, you couldn't make certain appeals, but now you can, right? Is the real question for those of us who are not students of American politics when we look at this. And it is not that this didn't exist before, but the question of what is it about these appeals that has been now made to be, that it's been made permissible to say certain things, whereas it wasn't permissible. I have a comment from here from Ron Adams. The current concept of identity politics has risen particularly as the postmodern fragmentation has blown the white/male view of the world out of the mainstream. Now we have all the different silos of understanding, and it is also unsustainable for a coherent future. The question is, what cultural new wave is on the horizon? I believe it is an evolutionary move to a new cultural understanding where we engage with each other's virtues, rather than the current practice of only focusing on each other's pathologies? So that's an interesting question, right? Of, are people going to feel that this current political moment or cultural moment is the time for a recalibration, right? In terms of walk away from what many of us feel in our politics is the moment of it's a feeling of polarization and confrontation.
Can I, interrupt really quickly? Because I think we missed, I want to make sure we answer this, a clarification question that Brian O'Reilly asked earlier.
Excellent.
He asked to define, for Dr. Fortner to define to explain the definition of Irish political machines.
Thank you.
So early in the 20th century, you had democratic organizations that were led by Irish immigrants, and they sort of recruited Irish immigrants as activists in the machines, and they focused on providing goods and services, distributing some of the resources of the state to their communities. And so Irish machines refer to those political organizations, those sort of democratic organizations that came to dominate urban politics in a lot of cities in the early part of the 20th century.
Right, and Professor DeGraw also adds that we should be thinking of earlier social movements focused on the interests of particular identity groups, whether it's the women's movement, the Chicano movement, right? But this is a real question also about immigrant integration, or how groups become integrated into the political process, in terms of the norms of integration, and also the role of political parties at that time, at the time of the machine. Right? What was the purpose of people were being mobilized for votes, but they were getting something in return, correct?
Well, many of them, not all. I mean, they did.
But they were promised. They were promised.
I mean, they did give out turkeys during Christmas and Thanksgiving, and so and many of them did get jobs. But you got the good jobs if you were part of close to the machine, and at the top, district captains and that kind of stuff.
Right. I have an interesting comment here from David Jones, from Professor Jones. He says, saw an ad on Facebook with a person in Biden mask trick-or-treating. The person pulls off the Biden mask, and it's actually Kamala Harris, who then steals all the candy. How much of that ad is about socialism versus about racial fear/stereotypes? All right, since that's kind of social media-ish, Tanisha, I'm sending that one out to you. Sorry.
Oh my God, that's really funny. I've never heard of that ad, but I'm glad you mentioned it, because I did want to talk about some of the campaign ads that have been going out recently. I know you're saying social media is kind of my turf as the young person, but I wonder if you professors have seen some of Donald Trump's ad thumbnails on YouTube. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Well, I actually have a tab open. I don't know if I can share screens. Can I, Professor?
Yes, give me 1 sec.
Okay.
All right, you should be able to do it now.
All right, that's great. 1 moment. Oh God, now I look like an old person. I don't know how to work this.
It offers you which program you want to go to, right?
All right, can you guys see this?
Yes.
So here I have Donald Trump's YouTube page. I don't know how many of you guys have seen this before, but what I wanted to look at, sorry, he posts so much, I'm losing where my thumbnail was. So he's got a few right here, do you trust Joe Biden with your money? And this has a very close-up shot of him with some very dramatic titling, and there's a lot of emojis in them. This one here is, did something happen to Joe Biden? Again, a really frequent use of emojis, and that's not even my favorite. My favorite would be this one, prevent a zombie uprising. And if you watch this, it's a 30-minute video, but it's 15 seconds of the same flashy thing on repeat for 30 minutes. I'm gonna stop sharing right now if I figure out how. Oh God, this was a bad idea. Can someone guide me on how to stop sharing screens?
It should be at the top of your screen where there's like a green bar and then red says stop sharing.
Thank you. I figured it out. So that was very interesting to me. Obviously, I think those thumbnails are meant to attract sort of a younger audience. And that was super interesting because I think that's a category of identity politics that we seldom think of when we think of identity politics. We usually think of race, gender, etc., but I don't think age comes up a lot. And one of the reasons for that, obviously, is because, you know, in all of contemporary history, the youngest voter bloc has always had the lowest voter turnout. And then it increases proportionately with age, with the 65 and up voter bloc having the highest voter turnout. So we kind of get ignored, but a lot of people are predicting that voter turnout amongst young people this campaign is going to increase. Certain states like Texas, the number of young people under 30 who've submitted early voting ballots is about like 2/3 of the total number of young people in those states to vote in the 2016 election. So young people have been mobilized in recent years. So it's very interesting to see how politicians are quickly adapting to that. And so we find very humorous thumbnails like those. And I know also Alessandra Ocasio-Cortez did this Twitch stream where she played Among Us, which is a very popular game right now with Generation Z. She played that to promote voter participation. So yeah, that's an interesting trend I noticed.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think at some point we're going to put some information in the chat about how everyone can vote, right? We do remember that we are in the middle of early voting. And we, as a political science department, we care that our students understand about participating in the political process. We are in early voting right now. There's a link that we're putting up also about where you can find your early voting site, which is not necessarily your regular voting site. So that's also really important to know. And also another site where you can find information if you're not in New York City and you need to find out where to vote. So thank you, Tanisha. You know, you're the demographic that you're talking about, we got to prove them wrong, right? We got to prove it, and our students can go out there and show them that the 18 to 24 demographic is on the rise to participate. But clearly, the rise of this move towards social media, pushed in some ways by the septuagenarian president himself, who has been tweeting and has not stopped tweeting from his personal Twitter account. So that's also part of it. But that the idea that of reaching a different demographic and identity politics, meaning age. It's a terrific question about that. We have another comment here from Hajra Shaukat, who says, we can also position Trump as part of a global rise of nationalist populists. In that case, would we say identity politics has also globally played a role in the rise of these leaders? Or does America have a unique, so to speak, understanding or conception of identity politics? I think that's something that Professor Rivera-Burgos was talking about, this question of it's not necessarily, that the US it's not only the United States, but if you look at the US, do you see it as there are certain kinds of certain characteristics that do make the US different?
Yeah, it's interesting. I love this question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. Like the specific, I don't know that I can speak too much to the specific link between identity politics and nationalism or populism. But I do think there is something unique to the conception of race in the US that makes identity politics in the US different from other parts of the world. The cases I'm most familiar with in regard to identity politics are some cases in Latin America. Like, for example, when Evo Morales won for the first time the presidency of Bolivia. This is a country that's like majority indigenous, where the main language of many people is not Spanish, yet they had never had an indigenous president. And one of the ways that he was successful was activating those identities in people that, or in a way that had not been activated politically before. It hadn't become salient. So there's definitely instances of that all over the world. I'm not sure that all the leaders that do that are also nationalists and populists. Maybe that by definition, I don't know. I'm trying to think through that. Maybe they are. But in the case of the US, I think the racial dynamics, the race relations in the US, I don't know of any other country. I think the one that it's often compared to is South Africa, but even that is pretty different. But that history of institutionalized state sanctioned segregation that the US still, you know, suffers the legacies of is not something that we see in a lot of other countries. But it is seen, I think it is used now a lot as a model for minorities in other countries to organize. And we saw it even this summer, the protests around police brutality spread throughout the world in many other countries. So not to say that police brutality and racism don't exist anywhere else, but there is something about the US that I think the context that is very unique to the US, and then maybe serves as an example for social movements around the world.
I'm not a comparativist, but I just would like to add another variable
Me neither,
here.
clearly.
No, you're brilliant. That was brilliant. We also need to think about the evolution of capitalism. Right. I mean, I think it may not be a coincidence that a lot of this is coming after the crash in 2008. And so I think as a analytical approach to this question of populism, comparatively, I think we have to sort of look at the racial formations that are indigenous within particular countries, evolution of sort of capitalist systems that are global, but also may be instantiated in particular ways within individual national settings, and then the ways in which their polity may or may not create opportunities for the activation of certain types of identities or ways to reinforce the indigenous racial formations.
Great. I mean, this is also we have a question here or a continuation of a conversation with you about the Irish political machines from Brian O'Reilly Costello. And I wanted to, shifting from Irish political machines where votes are guaranteed by giving jobs and much more, now identity politics has shifted to voting specifically for the benefit or pride of your race. Any thoughts, Dr. Fortner? Has this divide been beneficial for individual races, or has this been a detrimental divide in the Democratic Party? This goes back to the tribalism comment before.
So again, I don't use the term identity politics, and so I mean, going back to an earlier question or a series of questions, I think we there have always been social groups, and social groups have always mattered in profound ways in politics. But in those periods, they didn't use the term identity politics. And so I don't think we need to be wedded to that term as a way of understanding what we mean when we say that social groups are important in political practices. And so in terms of the Irish machine versus today, it's a complicated question, and I'll get in some trouble because I'm actually a fan of the Irish machine and a way of providing benefits to their members and to groups. And so to the extent that Black machines in many cities like Baltimore or Atlanta, even sort of Black politicians in New York can actually sort of use their power that they've gathered through racial solidarity to actually dispense patronage and material goods to Black folk. I think that would be a good thing. I think the complication is that the structure for the political machines don't exist as much in terms of them having direct access on jobs, city jobs, etc., civil service exams, and a variety of other reforms complicated that link. And so if Black sort of Black middle class leaders were able to sort of use race not only to get elected, but also to distribute goods and services in particular ways to marginalized groups within their communities, I would be supportive of that. Yes.
There's really a question also about I mean, I'm an IR person, right? Sort of comparative IR. And what I find also interesting is the fact that we also, the question about how do we compare identity politics in the US versus other places, I thought of Brexit. And I thought this is a really interesting case. I mean, I don't study British politics, but what's interesting about the activation of this kind of anti-European Union, British nationalism in the Brexit debate was also the age component, right, Tanisha? Right, there was a big divide between urban and rural, but there was also a big divide between younger and older. But this sort of conception of this us versus them, like the younger people could see feeling very British and also seeing compatible with being a member of the European Union, whereas the older generation really was feeling that Europe was taking from them. Again, I come back to that idea of the zero-sum game, right? This idea that identity politics gets activated, and you have this, and it is a form of mobilizing people to view things in an us versus them kind of thing. So I want to move the conversation to looking more specifically about Campaign 2020, right? Because I'm sure that many of the students, this may be the first campaign in which they will then have the chance to vote. For some, it'll be maybe, their other experience was in 2016. What's different now versus 2016? What's different, and is it just, the perception that that identity politics is adding to, it's already a contentious and in some ways very polarizing election? Or are we exaggerating the role of identity politics? Are there other issues that are more important, COVID being one of them in the campaign, and how are the two political parties mobilizing this concept? So maybe shall I start with you again, Tanisha?
Yeah, sure. First, I wanted to sort of connect it to a previous conversation we had about, the median white voter feeling alienated because of identity politics. And I think definitely, even if we just look at the Democratic ticket, we can see sort of this compromise between that median white voter that's alienated by identity politics and the fact that the left wing is mobilizing towards identity politics, and the fact that Joe Biden, he constantly sort of, promotes the fact that he's from like Scranton, because I think he's trying to win over sort of that white working class, that Catholic American vote. But even before he knew who his vice president was going to be, what we did know and what he did share with us was that his vice president was going to be a woman. And then a few months later, he shared with us that the decision was between 4 Black women. So I think that's sort of in the ticket, we can see sort of that compromise where he's still trying to engage with votes from both sides of the situation.
Right. I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, that is the Democratic Party's way of engaging identity politics was a certain symbolic politics. And as you pointed out in your first comment, that identity politics in some ways has to do with, do you vote for somebody who is like you? And the assumption is that you would, but it's also about what does it mean that he, as an older white man from Scranton, working class guy, would choose a Black woman? That's the symbolism of that also, that the Democratic Party is trying to put forward that particular view. But is it creating? Do you think that was a winning proposition? Is this something that you think is, is this going to be a vote getter for the Democratic Party? What about those that were disappointed about Bernie Sanders not being nominated, or Elizabeth Warren? Because Kamala Harris is not a very radical figure, although she's also the first Asian American candidate for vice president, and she is the daughter of immigrants. So she has also that aspect of her identity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And now, I've already touched on this in the past, but I haven't been alive for that many presidential elections. So correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of like the pool of candidates that were like running for the Democrat nomination, that was probably the most diverse pool that the DNC saw. And yet it sort of came down to like what looks like a typical US president in history, And so I think that just shows, well, there's many ways you can account for that. First of all, the white median voter, it accounts for a large portion of the electorate, but also, no, I don't think it's going to really, I don't think the fact that Kamala Harris is the vice president is something that's swaying the election. If you look at certain polls, I'm thinking 538 specifically, the portion of Black voters that vote Republican, which is roughly 10% of the Black demographic, they're continuing to support Trump. So the number is still the same in almost every key state.
Right.
So
So I have yeah, go ahead, Michael. Yeah, go ahead.
So the people who actually saved Joe Biden's campaign were not white guys from Scranton. It was Jim Clyburn in South Carolina and older Black voters. And so there's an interesting question here about, again, I think we overuse the term identity politics, but trying to figure out, what was sort of the logic of that occurrence, right? How do we understand Black voters who had potentially, other options, sort of voting for the white Catholic working class guy, as opposed to other people? And again, that's why I think we should broaden our analysis to include other variables when we sort of want to talk about identity politics. Some people have said that they were being extremely pragmatic in the ways in which they were trying to assess what the median voter writ large might do with the ticket. Other people think they are sort of just fundamentally more conservative than a lot of elites think they are. I think all of that is true, but I think the analytic point is that identity politics itself does not give us much leverage over that kind of complicated outcome.
Right, and we have a comment here in the chat here from Shelley. Eversley says, yes, this return to the binary is so old. Young people don't have the time for that kind of thinking. It feels like the last gasp of a generation losing its hold. The majority of US elementary school children are not white, so the future is brown. And Brian O'Reilly Costello says the real symbolism is the announcement of choosing a Black woman before choosing one. And David Jones says at various points early on, Harris was leading in the polls and then Warren. So, but the things about Harris is that, she's a choice of somebody who has had a very, from what I see, a very, normal kind of conservative type political career, in the sense that she has risen up through the ranks of the Democratic Party in California. She's held positions like Attorney General. That now there are some that question about her, what did you do when you were Attorney General of California and the like. And so I want to also think about, in some ways, the more hot button issue of in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the rise of protests and the kind of identity politics intersection of the and social movement, but also really sort of the sense of the Trump administration not only activating the white identity, but activating law and order, right? So this is all very complicated, but race is involved here, and we don't necessarily. It's difficult to parse out, as we say, but this is definitely part of what's happening right now. We saw what happened in Philadelphia. This is going to, and this is anything that's very close to the election. We have to think about that, the way that it's viewed, the way it's framed. So I'd like to hear what our panelists think about, that at this point in time, in terms of whether they see this as going to be anything that will have an impact or not. So, Viviana, we want to give it a shot.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that when you first phrased the question about what's different about this election compared to 2016 in terms of these issues specifically. And I think the protests that we've seen recently, that I would call more of a social movement at this point than like a renewed civil rights movement, more than just a few isolated protests. That's definitely something that didn't happen right before the 2016 election. And of course, in the context of a pandemic that has affected Black and brown people disproportionately. But I have no idea. Like, I would love to see, or maybe do a research project on this in the future, whether these protests, who would, in terms of the two candidates, who do they favor? Because I could envision them favoring Biden, in that a lot of Democrats, or maybe more conservative Democrats, white Democrats in particular, recent polls have shown that they've gotten more racially liberal. Their racial attitudes have changed. And not only that, but that a poll I saw recently showed that more white Democrats now say that they understand racial equality more deeply than ever before. So is that a direct result of the social movement, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter? And so will that benefit Biden? Or like you said, bringing up these issues of law and order, will that mobilize Republicans to turn out? Or are these things not even the main driver of people's decisions to turn out? Maybe it is all about the economy and the pandemic, and it's not really about that. And finally, to Professor Everly's point, sorry, or Evers, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the Shelley correctly. I don't want to say it wrong. About the binary being so old, I agree 100%. And one thing I've been really interested in looking at this election and more generally in my research is these interracial coalitions that may or may not form, particularly between Latinos and African Americans being the largest two minority groups. Latinos I think it's a very kind of complicated topic because they do exhibit high rates of group consciousness, and that has increased recently too. But it's more of that doesn't necessarily imply that they see a lot of commonality with Blacks. However, they have started to care more, according to recent data, about racial inequality. Not that the main issues for Latinos are still healthcare, the economy, jobs, immigration, but now racial inequality it's almost at the top 5. I think it's 6 on the list of the issues they care about most, out of a list of like 20 things. So I think that's pretty significant. And it's something to watch out for as well. Their attitudes towards Black Lives Matter, participation in protests. A lot of the protests had really wide variation in terms of who participated in them. It wasn't just young Black people participating in the protests. There was a very multiracial phenomenon and is. So I think that's something definitely different about this year, or at least more salient this year than earlier.
So that's absolutely right. The murder of George Floyd changed everything, and a lot of surveys of whites, particularly college-educated whites. And what you saw immediately in that first month was this profound embrace of racial justice as an issue, of police reform, a variety of sort of specific systemic police reforms. Those numbers have declined a bit since then, but are still pretty significant in terms of whites' support for racial justice and focus on racial justice issues. I think that the question for me for this election and the outcome, and let's assume that Biden wins. If not, I will need a lot of expensive therapy, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to teach for the rest of the semester. But let's assume Biden wins. The question is, how does he understand his governing coalition? Right? Well, how does he understand his opportunities and constraints? And there's a way in which, again, going back to my earlier comment about suburban white women, that if you sort of see this as a coalition of suburban white women who are concerned about aesthetics and morality of the president, and you miss the ways in which healthcare and other material concerns are driving their issues, I think you may try to construct the wrong type of governing coalition that won't be as progressive as possible. And I think out there, despite how the media constructs identities and identity politics, there is I think, a robust progressive governing coalition that Biden, if he wins, can use to actually implement robust progressive social policies. But the question becomes, how will he and the media elite make sense of that coalition going forward, make sense of identity politics after he wins?
Tanisha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to bring up the same thing that Professor Fortner did about the distinction and another category of identity, which is being college educated or not, because I think even within the white demographic, you can see very almost drastically different voting patterns based on whether they have college degrees or not. And a very important shift is that whereas in 2016, Trump, he had a pretty large white people with college degrees, he had a pretty large support from them. But after, very unfortunately, the George Floyd killing, Joe Biden saw sort of a jump in polls, and I think white people with college degrees are leaning more towards him now because they sympathize with these racial issues. A lot of the people I know, and I want to go back to something you said, that to them, Biden is a bit too moderate for their taste. They support things that Biden has openly, especially in the presidential debates, Biden had to openly voice his opinion, whereas he was hesitant. For example, I think Trump really coaxed it out of him that no, he wasn't for defunding the law enforcement. And then Trump very humorously said, "You just lost the left." And so I think that's very important, that distinction between the left that wants to defund the police and then sort of the center moderate white Americans that Biden is very popular with.
That's this, do you want to, Professor Fortner, did you want to respond or no? No, okay. I've got a comment here from, or a question from Professor Jones, who says, I'd like to hear our panelists' opinion on Trump's efforts to court Black male voters. And then I would also want to know what's going on with those Latino men that keep getting all that attention in the New York Times and in The Economist. Professor Fortner, you want to go?
Sure. So this brother isn't voting for him. I'm not sure how, if that answers your question. Look, it's a brilliant campaign strategy to try to depress the Black vote by making sure that some proportion of Black males think twice about voting for Joe Biden. I think they did that successfully for Mrs. Clinton, and I think they're trying to do it again. I don't, Ice Cube and then 50 Cent, and then 50 Cent sort of retracted, so who knows? But my sense, again, I would have to look at survey data after this is over, is that it's not very effective thus far. The numbers still seem like, he may do slightly better than perhaps last time, but with turnout and with still these sort of large margins for Biden, I don't think it makes a difference. But it is concerning. I've seen it on Facebook, on Twitter. There is a concerted campaign to make sure a certain population of Black men think twice about voting for Joe Biden. But I don't think it's going to have a significant effect on this election.
Can I add to that? I agree that I don't think it will have a significant effect, and they're making it seem like there's more of them on board than they really are, most likely, and it is a good campaign strategy, I guess. But one thing I've been hearing a lot and reading a lot lately in that regard is that what he's trying to tap into is misogyny, like this portrayal that he does of macho personality may appeal to some Black and Latino men. Not sure why it would appeal to them more than to white men, or why that would outweigh any of the other issues that Black and Latino men might care about. But that's one theory to explore. And in terms of Latino support for Trump, my understanding is also that it's not any higher than it's been for other Republican candidates. So usually about 30% of Latinos vote Republican. And that's, of course, mainly concentrated in Florida, Cubans, not just them, but mainly. And yeah, I don't think it's been any higher for Trump than for other Republican candidates in the past. And if anything, I think it's been a little bit lower. So I'm not sure what effect those appeals are having.
Also, for Black men, there's a conflicting message. So part of what he's doing, interestingly, is sort of arguing that Biden created mass incarceration. And then he goes before white audiences and says, law and order, law and order. And so, I mean, if he's not able to, I think, create a consistent message or frame his campaign in a way that might be effective, because we may hear his critiques of Biden and his role in the crime bill, et cetera, but we also hear him when he says law and order, law and order, law and order. And I think a lot of people, a lot of sisters on Facebook and elsewhere are emphasizing to brothers across the country the ways in which Biden would be disastrous for Black men in this country. And I think that, again, may limit the effect of the strategy.
You mean Trump?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what I thought. So David Lindsay, Professor Lindsay has a comment. He says, I wanted to ask a similar question to Professor Jones. What leads a candidate to, in one presidential debate, decline to condemn white supremacy, then in the next debate describe himself as having done more for Black Americans than anyone since Abraham Lincoln, while condemning Biden for his record on racial issues? This is the fact that you say that he's saying two different things.
Yeah, but so part of this is the sort of the foolishness of Donald Trump as a candidate, that he can't. I mean, in many ways, the racial appeals could be stronger with a smarter Republican running than it is right now, I think, in his hands. Again, you can make a credible case against him and the Clintons, Biden and the Clintons, and their role in mass incarceration. But then when, in your next breath, you compare yourself to Lincoln, that just sounds foolish. And so I think his inability, his campaign's inability, and this is not just on race and the African American community, but across the board, his campaign's inability to focus on a particular message and to be clear and efficient and targeting those messages to and consistent, right, to communities, is undermining, the effectiveness of these racial appeals.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's hard, or I find it hard to try to rationalize sometimes what Donald Trump says, or like try to analyze it like you would analyze another candidate's messaging. I just can't.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about Donald Trump. He's a disruptive candidate, and disruption is part of what he's selling, right? He's selling the idea that he wants people to think that he's willing to say things that other people aren't willing to say. And he's also willing to say what he thinks is going to take for people to vote for him or not vote. And there's
Stephanie, but last time he was very effective in saying, look, the Clintons are corrupt. We all know they're corrupt. And so why are you going to vote for them for another 4 years? Give me a chance. And that was his sort of consistent message in a lot of ways, and he sort of used that to sort of frame his appeals to particular groups. Now his message doesn't have the coherence or the consistency that it had 4 years ago. And that's why I don't think sort of these appeals or his disruption is going to be as effective.
There's a comment on the chat from Andrea Lai, who says, going back to Professor Rivera-Burgos, I've heard from Latinos, primarily ones that are first-generation Americans, that the reason why they would want to vote Republican is because of the fear of socialistic ideas in the Democratic Party. Their families immigrated from places to escape socialism. In the first place, that would be the Cuban Americans in Florida, but also some who immigrated from Venezuela. Right, that's also the case, and that seems to be a pretty solid block. But I'd also be interested to see if there's also a generational difference there. And we're also thinking about Latinos in Texas. Does everyone like to talk a little bit about Texas? I mean, this is it's an interesting state, and it's kind of up for grabs, and it's in a way that it hasn't been before. So should we mess with Texas? Who's messing with Texas? All right, go ahead.
No, I don't know that I want to speak about Texas specifically, but I wanted to say a bit more about that, about Latino Republicans. So I think historically, yes, the impetus behind most of Latino Republicanism has been concerns about socialism, communism, experiences from their home countries or their parents. And I do, to what Professor Golub was just saying, there has been a generational shift, primarily among later generation Cubans who are now third, fourth generation, a lot of them. But I also wanted to answer to, I think it was Professor Jones who brought up the social conservatism. That is also part of it. However, I don't think it's the main driving force, but yes, a lot of Latinos, most Latinos are Catholic, and care about issues like abortion and gay marriage. However, they're not single issue voters in that sense, in the way that white evangelicals prioritize those issues. So I think often they vote more on policies like economic security or like safety net type policies, and immigration, of course, those usually outweigh. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure one thing I cannot understand as a Puerto Rican is Puerto Rican support for Trump, which I have seen these random rallies lately with signs that say Puerto Ricans for Trump. And I don't think we can use that excuse about socialism or communism, maybe social conservatism, but I just find that bizarre and very hard to explain.
I mean, Viviana, could they be evangelicals?
They could. I mean, there is a growing percentage of them in all of Latin America, actually, primarily driven by American missionaries. So maybe, but I would love to see, maybe there is some data coming out of Florida after the election that would shed some light on that. But especially after how the Trump administration handled the hurricane in 2017, not sure what that's all about.
So there's a question from Professor Johnson who asks, is there any polling to show that the administration's policies of MPP, that's the Remain in Mexico issue of those that are coming from Central America, the policies of MPP and metering on the U.S.-Mexico border or the Mexico-U.S. border are shaping borderland behavior, I guess voting behavior, in terms of border security issues?
There might be, but I am not aware of that. I'm not sure if anyone else knows.
I'm looking at the chat now, see if anybody else is, if anyone knows the answer to that, please answer in the chat. We can read it out. That would be terrific, because I also don't know about Texas politics, but I am fascinated to know about that in terms of, you know, the impact. Professor DeGrasse says, a friend of mine, a Pomona College professor, was canvassing in Yuma, Arizona, and wrote, I canvassed for the Democratic Party in Yuma, Arizona today. The sun was intense, and so were the political divisions. I can confirm that many Latinos like the incumbent US president. Yikes. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Another theory is that Latinos do respond to those racial appeals to whiteness, especially white identifying Latinos, and that there is a lot of racial animus, colorism, all that within the Latino community. And some do respond to those appeals by President Trump, especially those maybe that are not as concerned about immigration, who are late. And in Arizona, I would imagine, is one of those cases where a lot of people who identify as Latinx are 7th generation or something Americans. So maybe those issues are not, like immigration, are not forefront in their minds. Just speculating at this point, but.
Professor DeGrasse says, I've done research in Houston, Texas since 2011, and it's been, so that's the person we should have on this panel, right? That's another event, right? And it's been interesting, she says, to see the city inch more and more toward a Democratic majority. It's also very interesting. Now, Joaquin Orozco says, Trump, in my opinion, is one of the most dangerous presidents in recent memory because one of his most important qualities is a toxic law and order that only benefits people like him. His old age has affected him severely, and he is now a malnourished candidate that has only increased in proving how horrible he is at being a leader, from disregarding COVID-19 as simple flu, and thus having a hand in the pandemic, to seeing Black Lives Matter as Antifa, despite how their protests are peaceful. It's only because of his police that they evolved into riots. The only way to get his second term is if he altered the election in his favor, which is very possible considering being favored by the Electoral College. We must find some defense against this, or the events of 2020 will only worsen more and more, no matter what activist groups do. And I think that the real question that I wanted to bring to, at the end of this is to say this question about the actual voting and the access to the vote, because there's definitely a racial dimension to that. There's a dimension to voter suppression. There's a dimension of that sort of, and a dimension to the fact that in this country, you know, the means of election are based on each individual state. So that's also a lot of things that Joaquin brings up, is that we also have to be concerned about people's access to vote and the agitation to give people access to the vote. There was a comment here earlier, which was asking whether or not the Get Out the Vote movement is really more on the Democratic side because of that feeling that is the president also trying to get out the vote, or is the president trying to decrease the vote? What is going on in that area? Does anyone have anything to add on that?
You know, I was wondering if we wanted to discuss the fact that the president sort of like is not committing to the idea of a peaceful transfer of power. I don't know if we want to entertain that idea at all, but certainly with the way Americans are voting in this election, he can sort of hide behind that rhetoric where if it's clear that he is not going to win the electorate vote, he will say that it's because of the flawed voting system currently.
So I'm an optimist here. I mean, our institutions have been failing us for a while now, but I like to think that if he does lose, that those institutions will sort of be there and will make sure he leaves when it's time for him to be evicted from the White House. But I do understand the skepticism, but I'm still a believer in and sort of the remaining American institutions and their ability to ensure a peaceful transfer of power.
Professor Rivera-Burgos, do you want to weigh in?
Sorry, I got kind of distracted reading the next question that was addressed to me. So I don't have anything to add to this one, but I can respond to that one.
What's the next question? Go ahead.
It is, are there any studies on Latino machismo and how that has led to voting for a particular party or voter ideologies? I actually don't know the answer to, I mean, I know there are, so the way surveys work for the most part in the US, there's usually only a small number of Latino respondents, which makes it hard to study their attitudes. But in recent years, a lot of surveys, well, maybe not a lot, but a handful of really good surveys specifically of Latinos have come up. There's one based in UCLA, for example. And I am pretty sure they ask, and I've seen questions about different social views on gender roles and gender relations, that kind of thing. Like what should be the role of a woman in the household, like those types of questions. And it is definitely something that I wouldn't say it's super prevalent, but exists as it does in the general population. I don't think it exists within the Latino community necessarily at higher levels than the average population. But what I don't think I've seen is a connection between that and vote choice or partisanship. But I'm sure it's doable, and maybe it is out there and I just haven't seen it.
Stephanie, I did see one question to me about the Supreme Court, and I should say that that's the one institution that I'm really sort of scared about. Look, I mean, I also think a lot, a few of them had actually worked on Bush v. Gore on the Republican side as lawyers. And so I have no confidence now in the new Supreme Court. And so if his departing from power depends on the Supreme Court, I am a bit sort of skeptical that our institutions will survive. But with that said, I am buoyed by the fact that people are voting like never before in Texas, the most sort of voter suppressed state. They're almost at their 2016 level, and there's still a few days to go. So hopefully people will, race to the polls, vote in large numbers, and there will be a clear victory on Tuesday, so that the Supreme Court won't need to get involved. But if they do have to get involved, I am concerned about the outcome in our democracy.
What do you think, though, of early voting? So I think if it reaches or has already reached 2016 levels of overall turnout, I'm not sure if that's what they mean, or of early voting in 2016. But if it has reached overall turnout levels of 2016, that's good. But one thing that concerned me about, I'm thinking of a saying in Spanish, like cantar victoria antes de tiempo. How do you say that, Stephanie? Like celebrating before, or counting your chickens before they hatch.
Counting your chickens before they hatch.
Because I do know some research shows that early voting can actually decrease turnout on election day. Like it can dilute the enthusiasm around the election, the media intensity of election day, those kinds of things. So when I see that so many people are voting early, like, okay, well, if we reach the levels that we need to reach before election day, that's great. But if we're still not there yet, I do worry that maybe it won't be such a surge in turnout as people are saying.
So, I mean, maybe we should turn to David for for some analysis and discussion here. I'm not a.
Yeah, sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's all right. I'm not a political behavior
and
person.
You've got 1 minute.
Political behavior person, but I do think there's some evidence that low propensity voters are sort of coming out, and so there are some positive, there are ways to sort of read this early data in a positive way. Of course, because of the last election, I'm still frightened and concerned and everything else, but I remain hopeful. And I think, and again, sort of seeing, and this may be foolish, seeing the YouTube videos and the clips on Twitter of Black voters with their chairs and dancing, and the ways in which they are sort of approaching this moment with such seriousness and joy and purpose, that I do think we might be able to expect a good outcome on Tuesday, but we'll see.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. I wish we could stay on longer. This has been really just a sensational experience to get a chance to have this kind of conversation. I really want to thank our speakers. You've gone above and beyond to help us understand these issues. Tanisha, Mahmud, Professor Viviana Rivera-Burgos, and Professor Michael Fortner. I want to thank the Department of Black and Latinx Studies and Interim Chair Shelley Eversley for co-sponsoring this event with us. And I really want to thank everyone who joined. We have 43 people on this call. It's such a gratifying feeling to know political science and Black and Latinx Studies. We are Baruch, we are CUNY, and thanks to the students at the CUNY Graduate Center who also were here with us and joined this conversation. And we hope to see you again at another one of our events. Be well, stay safe, and please be sure to vote. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.